Aubrey, hello. So good to
Hey,
see you.
Doug. It's good
Um,
to see you too. It's been a little bit.
it has been, and I've missed our conversations, and so I'm excited to get restarted on them. It's so important to talk about China and U.S.-China relations and China and the world, and also when it's appropriate to talk a little bit about leadership. While you were away, we had a couple of nice sessions with David Slocum, and on one of them, I did an interview with him on his expertise in creative leadership. David's one of the co-founders of OGL. And so and I've been a friend and colleague of his for 30 years. And we've been working together on a number of things, from NYU to the Berlin School of Creative Leadership to then the founding of OGL. And now he's with us at Thunderbird as well. And so it was fun to get to talk to him a little bit about creative leadership. And I always like to remind our audiences that, yes, our expertise is and focuses on China, but we also have a big focus on leadership and how to think about creativity in the world. And so anyway, I'd love the conversations with you, but it was nice to get a quick conversation with David as well. So today, what I'd like to do is I'd like to kind of carry on our discussion about China. And so really get back to focusing in on China. We have a lot of important things that are going on in the world today, and want to talk about them. I want to primarily talk about the 15th five-year plan, and sort of help our audiences understand what's happening in China and how to think about these issues. But before we do that, I'd love to talk about some current events. So anything you want to chime in on that you'd like to see the direction of the conversation go?
No, happy to see where you want to take it.
Awesome. So again, we'll get to the 15th five-year plan in a minute or two, but I first just want to look at a couple of things that are going on in the world today and just sort of think about China's role in the world and what it all means. I don't know if you saw an article not too long ago about Jensen Huang, who was the CEO of NVIDIA. And he was making some comments about China and AI and how it will be horrible if DeepSeek uses the Huawei chip and, a couple of other things. But I wanted to just chat a little bit about that just because, China and AI is an important thing. We actually, I don't know if I've told you this story, but some time ago, I'm on the AI committee at Thunderbird, and I've really sort of been a curmudgeon about AI for a long time because, it just feels like it's destroying education. It's, making people dumber. We have so many students that just, they'll get a question for class and be writing a paper, and then we'll discover that they just copied the whole thing from AI and they didn't do any real critical thinking themselves. And so I've been sort of the curmudgeon on the faculty about this. But eventually, not too long ago, the chair of the committee came to me and said, "Doug, I need you to give a talk on AI in China." And I said, "Angelina, this is not my thing. I'm the curmudgeon about AI. I just don't like what's happening in terms of how it's being introduced. Like, Doug, put your big boy pants on. You got to do this because we need to be thinking about it." And so it forced me and my China team to sort of study and learn about AI. And it was a really interesting moment because, if you just go to ChatGPT or any AI and sort of ask what the differences between China and the United States are with AI, the answer will be, well, the United States is very good at creating a very social system and, really interfacing with the users. And China is much more focused on math and logic and logistics. So it's not nearly as user friendly, which is probably true. Except one of the things that's so interesting is that China's focus with AI and DeepSeek is really to use AI to create the best manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so, yes, it might feel sort of less user friendly and less sociable, but it's probably much more effective in terms of the economy. And so, it was just an interesting learning process for me to go deep on that. Now, just getting back to in NVIDIA, the Jensen Huang's comment, what he's talking about though is the fact that Huawei is now in the process of producing its own microchips, and AI is sort of breaking off from the dependence on the United States and TSMC. And, they're really kind of developing their own process. For a long time, I've said, I think it was a huge mistake to isolate Huawei and cut them off from the United States, because the way you know what your competitors are doing is by partnering with them and working with them. And so the fact that we've kind of pushed Huawei out the door, there was that moment when the U.S. Was visiting China about 2 years ago, and they came out with their phone on exactly that weekend that we were visiting because they wanted to show, like, we can do this by ourselves. We don't need you guys. And so I think that Huawei's a big force in the world. And so I think that's what the NVIDIA CEO is saying. But I don't know, did you have any thoughts on AI, China?
Well, I just think doesn't NVIDIA sell chips to China?
Yeah.
So I guess what's the difference between buying chips from NVIDIA versus buying chips from Huawei? And it seems like, that's maybe just competitive posturing.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's a good framing for it. I think that his point is that, he's sort of subtly making the point that I was just making and have made many times when I give talks on China, is that, again, when we cut Huawei off, we no longer know what they're doing. We no longer know where, they're just developing their own internal technology, then they're doing fine with it. I think then the next step, to your point, is, well, if they then become the sort of engine for China's entire AI system, not only is it less of a customer base for NVIDIA, but it's also, we just don't know what they're doing. And so it's, I think that's really the interesting sort of conundrum or danger here. And so I think that's what he's saying. The second issue is caught my eye in the news recently, is this letter that 3 senators wrote to President Trump saying that the China automobile industry should not be allowed to operate in the United States. And this is in response to a talk that President Trump gave in Detroit a couple of weeks ago, where he basically said, yeah, if BYD wants to come and build a factory here, bring them. Let's create jobs. Which, you and I have talked about the tariff issues many times, and how stupid I think the tariffs are, because if tariffs are set up to raise the prices at the border so that we will, then buy cheaper goods that are made in America, the problem with that logic is you have to have a manufacturing supply chain that can create the jobs. And so, we can't build iPhones in America because we don't have the manufacturing supply chain that produces the components, modules, and final assembly. Final assembly, actually, Foxconn was in conversations about building a plant in Wisconsin not too long ago, but final assembly is not the phone. Like, you still have to have these industrial clusters of just hundreds of factories that are producing the modules and components. And so anyway, when President Trump gave this talk about inviting BYD to Michigan, for me, I think it's smart, because I think that actually, the best way to create jobs is to learn from the place that has the best manufacturing supply chain in the world. And so, bringing them here means that you're going to build factories and create more manufacturing jobs, and it's going to be good for everybody. But the senators wrote to the president, and they said, this is dangerous. We cannot have Chinese manufacturers in the United States, and, sort of on and on about the dangers of it and the risks with, China getting access to technology in the United States, et cetera. In my opinion, this is a really stupid letter, and it's a stupid, I'm not a huge fan of President Trump, but this was one of the talks he gave that I actually thought was the right way to go. Is, if you want to have a trade war and you want to have tariffs, we also need help in rebuilding the manufacturing supply chain here. And, having BYD here, BYD is the most powerful electric vehicle manufacturer in the world right now, more powerful than Tesla. They are moving fast, and they are eating up the market of building electric vehicles and selling them to the world. And, I think it would be good to partner with China and create jobs in America by doing that. So anyway, I thought this was just a really dumb letter from the senators. What did you think?
I think it's interesting. I wonder if it was a different country, how would we feel? If it was a Japanese electric car company, if it was an Indian electric car company, if it was a Canadian electric car company, how would we react? I do think as a culture, we are wary of China. I hear that in conversations that I have with people. There's just an assumption that China is spying on the United States and its citizens. I don't know if that's where that comes from, and, what truth is there. But there is just an overall wariness of, partnership with China. I think there's that competitive nature that we all have as Americans, but it does seem sort of anti, free market. Aren't we supposed to be competitive? And I guess, it's one thing to compete against somebody that is sprouting, in the soil in the neighboring lot versus, traveling across and planting right next to you. So I think that it just speaks to sort of our inherent, competitiveness, but also the outlines that there still is a lot of mistrust between, U.S. citizens and when they think about China.
Yeah, it's a great framing of it. To your point, if we want to be in a capitalist economy and we want to be a capitalist society, we need to compete and collaborate and build and learn from other players in the market. And so, yeah, I like that framing. I think that's great. The final thing before we get into our discussion of the 15th five-year plan is we can't ignore the situation in the Middle East and sort of China's role in this situation. I don't have any sort of deep opinions or knowledge of this, but it's just, I think it's a really, really just dangerous time. And it's a scary time. We've talked a little bit about the ways in which this situation has sort of really kind of mystified and put China off because they were, Trump sort of made the relationship better in September of 2025 because Chairman Xi and called it the G2 meeting and, sort of made the Chinese people feel like he was really kind of thinking about the U.S. China partnership and the fact that we're the two largest economies in the world and we should be thinking of ourselves as the G2. We're the ones running the world. And so everybody was very much looking forward to his scheduled trip of March 30th to April 3rd, which then got put off because of the war in Iran. And so, I think the people I know in China who were sort of close to the politics of and the inner workings of the government were really frustrated because there was just no focus on planning this meeting, and it just didn't seem like they were treating it as the important continuation of the G2 conversation. Now Trump is planning on going. I think the trip was delayed about 5 weeks, so it'll be mid-May that he goes. But it's going to be, I think, a really interesting and important time. So there's certainly been that effect of the war, but I think it's also been really interesting just to kind of look deeper into just how much the world is dependent on the Strait of Hormuz and the flow of oil, and China is certainly deeply dependent on the flow of oil from the Middle East and from Iran. And so it's an interesting time. Any thoughts from
I was listening to an interview, I think it was yesterday on NPR, and they were interviewing small business owners in China and asking how this war and the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz is impacting their business, and it's impacting everybody everywhere. And there was one small business owner who he didn't want to say how much his prices had increased, but he was indicating that it was really expensive to operate his business. So, I think across the globe, I think, people are understanding not, technically understanding the supply chain of how the oil gets to their homes and cars and gas stations, but how they're feeling that price impact. And if we can't get the oil out of the Middle East, everything is just going to be so much more expensive. So I think, even small businesses in China are feeling the impact, and that is likely, I'm sure, going to have an impact on the conversation. So I'm guessing the conversation that Trump and President Xi would have had in this month is going to be drastically different than the conversation that they're going to have next month.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's a very, very, very tense time. And so it's, oh goodness, it's, the world is moving by quickly, and, there's a lot of real powerful players that have a lot of influence and a lot of resources. And, here again, we have to figure out how to build relationships. As I often say, you've heard me say this many times, we're married to China. There is no plan B. The fact that iPhones and Tesla's Gigafactory and single largest exporter from China in the United States is not a Chinese company. It's a little company called Walmart. And so, we are so deeply embedded there that we need to continue to figure it out. And if things got really tense and got a lot worse than they were from the period of September 2nd, 2025 on, it's going to be a mess. And so my hope is that the Trump administration takes these meetings seriously and treats them with the respect that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think the partnership is essential. I don't think there's any direct replacement for the United States, but as people are across the globe are not able to count on the United States as being consistent and reliable. I think it impacts both our allies, and the more tense relationships that we have across the globe. And I know that, we've talked about this with, Canada and Mark Carnby. There's a lot of other countries that are building relationships with China, and China is building relationships with them.
Right.
So it's something that we see as citizens, you see as a scholar, of how important it is. And yes, I do hope that that this administration, approaches the conversations with China coming up next month with some grace and humility.
Right.
But we've seen how this administration operates. I don't know that those are phrases that are going to describe the outcome, but I think it's important to approach it as if it's a conversation among partners. And I hope that that's the case.
Typically, when I think of President Trump, I don't think of the words grace and humility, but
No, I don't either.
Anyway, shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about a project that OGL has taken on over the last couple of weeks, because it was a major event in China, the passage of the 15th five-year plan. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about what was going on in this situation, and and hear your thoughts if you have any comments or questions about why this is so important and what the sort of details of the situation are. Just as a beginning question, is this something that was sort of below the radar screen for you? Like, were you sort of watching or thinking about it, or was it, how
Yeah, I think this is a good question, because, when you and I were talking on the phone the other day, you were mentioning the 15th five-year plan. And I was like, what is he saying before five-year plan? I was not aware of plans 1 through 14. So this is news to me. It doesn't surprise me that China has a five-year plan and consistently comes out with another one. And again, it strikes me the contrast between the United States and China is so different. I was researching whether the United States had anything similar to a five-year plan. And there's like little bits of plans that happen across different agencies and parts of the government that if you sort of mushed them together could be considered a five-year plan. But the, overall countrywide, this is our five-year plan. That doesn't happen here in the United States, partly because of our election cycle. And the way we have just the way our government is structured. So yeah, this is news to me. I think it's really interesting. There's a couple things that I found noteworthy in there, but I'd like to hear from your perspective and, your OGL hat, what you find most intriguing about the next 5 years in China.
Okay, wonderful. So, thank you for that. And, thanks for going and digging in and doing some research on this. If you sort of just do the math of this, that this is the 15th five-year plan. And so that means that plan 1 through 14, takes you back as far as the mid 1950s. And so China's been doing this a long time. Now, 1850s, you'll remember, were a very tense time because it was post-communist revolution, but then we have, Mao Zedong and the Cultural Revolution. And so there was sort of some idea of central planning and five-year plans that will help, plan by plan, elevate China into a much more powerful place and a more powerful economy. But the years from the Communist Revolution in 1949 till about 1978, Mao Zedong dies in 1976, Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1978. So that period, 1978 till today, is really the period that I mark as just the powerful moments of China's economic development. Now, to go to your point, what does it mean to have five-year plans? And we have such things in America, and we don't. Like, we think of ourselves as a capitalist democracy. And so, state by state, there is a planning process, but there's a planning process in Congress. These things aren't as structured as they are in China, with each five-year plan has sort of an agenda and what's going to unfold over the 5 years. And again, the period in Mao Zedong's time was really kind of chaotic. But when Deng Xiaoping came to power and then came to the United States in 1979 and shook hands with Jimmy Carter and, signed some agreements, and China really opened up to the world, we've just seen just a dramatic process of planning, but a mixture of planning and an openness to economic development and to capitalism. I think I told you the story that I got in trouble with the State Department not too long ago, a couple of years ago, because on our OGL site, I had written an article saying that communist China was better at capitalism than we are. And the people in the State Department were very angry. How can you say a communist country is better at capitalism than us? You better take that article down. But the interesting thing is, I do believe that, in order to have smart capitalism, you need a planning process of how you're going to develop. And if you want to have the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world, which China does, you need to have state investment, and you need a planning process to do that. And so China does a nice job of balancing both the planning part of the process and what we're going to achieve over these next 5 years and what the focus is going to be, with what we call local governments as industrial firms. It's a term borrowed from one of my favorite China scholars, Andy Walder. And so, it's not like the central government of Beijing is aggressively telling everybody what they have to do and sort of having a communist planned economy. What they are doing, though, is creating a culture of innovation at the local levels, and then sort of the general planning process of what the big areas of focus are going to be for each 5-year plan, and then kind of pushing the local governments to really come, and so when we say local governments as industrial firms, one of the interesting things about China that's so different from a capitalist democracy like the United States is that Chinese leaders and officials are basically, their entire careers are basically judged by their delivery on KPIs for their local areas. And so the way you advance in your Chinese political career is you build a strong economy, and you do that in a district, and then in the city, and then in the province. And that's how you advance in your career. And so, these 15 5-year plans sort of set the tone. And then, each 5 years, there's sort of a new idea of like, what are we going to focus on this time? Does that all make sense? And are there any comments or questions about that?
Yeah, it absolutely all makes sense. And it's, just on the very micro level, I draw from my own experiences, of trying to, get a small nonprofit board to come up with a 3-year plan, which was incredibly difficult at times. The diversity of opinions abound, even on a 6-person board in a small town. I can't imagine the process and what this is like in China to create an entire countrywide 5-year plan. So you mentioned the local governments as industrial firms, and the measurement of the leadership being measured by certain KPIs of economic growth. I just wonder, is this a top-down plan? Is the plan considering the plans of the local governments? How is information flowing either up or down? And is it only one direction, or is it more of a cohesive planning process where everybody gets a little bit of input?
It's a great question. And no, this is largely a national process, right? And so it's not a micromanaging process such that, they're looking at each and every district in every city and every province saying, you have to do this, you have to do this. But there are these sort of general priorities that are put in place and discussed at the plenums, and then, they're adopted as the next 5-year plan. But again, there's this interesting balance. And this is why I love Andy Walder's concept of local governments as industrial firms, because the local governments then have to figure out how to effectively execute on what the major large priorities of the 5-year plan are, and then implement them. And it creates this real culture of innovation at the local levels. And so it's a sort of I think a really kind of interesting process to think about in terms of what it means for capitalism, because more than any place that I've ever studied, but I know China better than the other countries in the world, just because I've devoted my life to studying it, but they've really created, in this notion of local governments as industrial firms, the culture of innovation at the local levels. And so all of these localities are supposed to take the big ideas of each 5-year plan and then figure out how they're going to implement them in different ways. And so it's a very powerful process.
Mhm. Yeah, there's a couple parts of it that stood out to me. One was, and I think they're related. There was a certain number of high value patents that was written into this 15th 5-year plan that was in the articles that we posted on our OGL site. I thought that was interesting, calling out a certain number of patents that, that's measurable. High value patents, that's obviously going to be something that's going to drive a large section of the economy, and and, the investment in education. That I found really interesting. And it also makes me curious about the impact on the United States education system. I know that there's a lot of, there are a lot of scholars coming in, students coming in from China to the United States. And if China is, really going to focus on building its own education system, economy, how's that going to impact the education system and economy in the United States? And so, yeah, just, patents and education just seem very related to each other. So how are you seeing those two things related? And I know that you have opinions on what's happening with education in China and the strategic partnerships that are happening there.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And, here again, this is a big area of concern for me in terms of the Trump administration, because, one of the things that has made the United States powerful as an economy and as a society is that, we are among the top in the world of higher education systems. I mean, there are great universities like Cambridge and Oxford in Britain. But, the U.S. higher education system for many years has been just such an attractive model for top students all over the world. And so, I've been in U.S. higher education for my whole life. And so but I've also been a China scholar my whole adult life. And so, like, I've seen very closely, like, how the flow of goods and the flow of brains come. I was giving a talk about a year ago in Beijing that was on people-to-people exchange and the relationship between China and the United States. And there was a pretty high-level person in the audience, and he stood up and he said, "Professor Guthrie, I just have to ask you, why do you guys hate us so much?" And I said, we don't. We love Chinese students, and we love, and he was like, "Well, I know you do, because you're a China scholar and you've spent your life doing this, but our perception is that you just don't want us anymore." And I have to tell you, my entire adult life, my wife and I have been raising our children, and the plan was for them to go to a top Chinese university and then go to Stanford or somewhere in the United States and then work in Silicon Valley. But we're not doing that anymore. We just can't. We don't feel safe. We don't feel like the United States will. And I just think that's a tragedy, because what that means is a lot of the smartest students in the most populous nation in the world, the second most populous nation in the world now. I think India has surpassed China a little bit, but they're not coming to the United States. They just don't feel wanted. And so what does that mean? That means brain drain. That means we're not going to get access to some of the smartest students in the world. And so that's, I think, just a very dangerous thing. But to add to your point about this, one of the things that was called out in the 15th five-year plan was a reinvigoration of the foreign joint venture university movement. So starting about, maybe it was 30 years ago, China started wanting to, China has a few really good universities like Beijing University and Tsinghua University and Shanghai Jiaotong University. But, again, universities like several in the United States and several in Britain were really regarded as the elite places for higher education. And so there started back in, 1990s, a movement of what was called foreign joint venture universities. And they're very complex systems to set up. But essentially what it means is, and I knew some of this firsthand because I helped NYU when I was a professor there set up a foreign joint venture university in China. And our partner was a university called Australian Daxue. And, what it meant was that NYU gets access to China because there's a degree that's a joint venture degree between these two universities. And so, if we want to send our young people to learn and to develop and grow, we have a place in China that they don't have to go to a Chinese university. They go to a foreign joint venture university. And it looked like there were going to be many of these. When we did it with NYU, we were the fourth, and there's now 11, but they've really sort of slowed down. It's become very, I think, part of the tension between, the United States and China and, China and the rest of the world in some places has just slowed this process down. And it's very hard to get approvals for these things now. And so it's interesting that they're calling this out in the 15th five-year plan, because essentially they're saying, like, we've got to get back to this. We really need to start to continue to develop joint venture universities so that we are attracting foreign students. And so, in some ways, it seems like they're doing the opposite of the tone that President Trump's administration has taken with Chinese people coming to the United States. And they're really saying we need to continue to develop in this area. So I think your reading was great, the 15th five-year plan and what the notes you took on it, because this is a really important part of what they're doing. And they've sort of recalled it out and said, we're going to continue to develop in this space. And so it's an interesting time. Any thoughts on that?
I think that, with anything, a plan, highlights what's on the minds and what's important to the citizens, of course, to the country, but it gives us an inkling of where the entire country is going to have its focus. So I think if there's, any folks who are listening to us who are looking to get into business in China, they should probably pay attention to what's happening in the 15th five-year plan, because that's going to give an understanding of where the soil is going to be fertile to plant seeds, in China. I think, I think this is a really great thing that OGL was highlighting, and because it really does say, like, this is where China's focus is going to be. This is where the investment is coming, because, we know that they're going to fund the plan. So what do you think about that in terms of, where, some of your focuses as, a leader in the Chinese economy and thinking about it? Where do you think folks might want to put their focus as we see where China is putting its focus?
Well, I mean, the real sort of key focus for China in the places that they want to do joint venture education with is in science and engineering. I mean, this is really where, it's not that they don't care about the humanities and sort of the softer social sciences, but really what they care about is the development of the smartest manufacturing supply chain in the world, and the development of just powerhouses in science and engineering. And so that's really going to be where the focus is. And the universities that are going to be successful at reestablishing foreign joint venture universities or establishing new foreign joint venture universities are going to be in that space. And so I think it's an interesting time, and it'll be interesting to see the collaborative relationships that happen with it. And I hope that there are more. I just, I believe that we do have the two largest economies in the world, the United States and China. And I believe China is going to surpass the United States as the most powerful economy in the world, probably in about 7 years. I think it's going to be important that we continue to collaborate. When I say things like we're married to China, it became so clear to me when I was doing work with Apple in China and just seeing how deeply embedded we were and how dependent we were on China. And so I just think it's going to be important to continue to develop in that space and to continue to collaborate. The one other issue that and there were several issues that were called out in the 15th five-year plan, but one of the other issues that really jumped out at me was the emphasis on dominance in electric vehicles. Here again, there are powerful players that are from the United States, like Tesla, and then there are players in Japan and other parts of the world. But China is really dominating this space now, in my opinion. I mean, they've become so powerful, and BYD vehicles are so much cheaper than Tesla vehicles. And so this is sort of related to the current events issue that we were just talking about a few minutes ago, but it's very clearly called out in the five-year plan as well. And so I think it, really, again, sets a tone or sets a signal where you have this calling out of this issue at the high levels of the government in the five-year plan, but then the local governments as industrial firms are incentivized to figure out how to be innovative in this space and figure out how to, and anytime you have one of the things that China does so well, and this is why it works so well for Apple, but it's similar to BYD, is, if you look at the difference between an organization like Tesla has its largest gigafactory in the world is in Shanghai, but it's a very vertically integrated factory system, right? They sort of build everything soup to nuts, to the end product inside. Whereas China has much more of a habit of kind of building these industrial clusters that create components like lithium batteries for electric vehicles, or like, the wheels, and so they're much less often vertically integrated systems and much more dependent on industrial clusters that a given city takes its opportunity to become dominant in that specific component, right? And so you have this sort of widely integrated system, but it's not a vertical integration the way of a large factory like the Tesla Gigafactory is. And so hearing the Chinese government say, we're going to be leaders in the world on electric vehicles, basically what they're saying to the local governments is, we want you all to figure out what part you're going to play in building these industrial clusters of components that are going to make us the most powerful place in the world for producing electric vehicles at a reasonable price. So anyway, it sort of jumped out at me and made me think that a lot of interesting stuff is going on here right now. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah, again, I compare it to what I know about the U.S. and what I've seen over the past. I don't even remember when electric vehicles became a thing, but and how dependent our car manufacturers are on the desires of consumers, and so they'll outfit entire plants to manufacture an electric vehicle, and then consumer demand shifts a little bit, and then they'll just change that entire plant to go back to combustion engine components and vehicles, and so there really hasn't been, I don't think, a consistent effort on the part of the auto manufacturers, and there hasn't been a consistent interest on the part of American consumers, so that electric vehicles just seem to be kind of like fits and starts and kind of a fad, and they end up being maybe more expensive, and so they're just a little bit more out of reach for American consumers when it comes to making an investment in a car. Sometimes that monthly payment is the decision maker. Maybe people want to have an electric vehicle, but it just doesn't make sense financially to spend an extra $10,000. And so again, the contrast from what's happening in China is that it's that central government, this is the plan. We are going to invest in electric vehicles. I think, the United States, we don't have that. It's different. It's very, market driven. And there just hasn't been that. I think the supply and the demand of electric vehicles just hasn't been matching. And this would be an interesting, I want to see this in a graph, right? Like the supply of electric vehicles, the demand of electric vehicles. And I'm going to just guess based on what I've seen is that they kind of don't match up. But I think it's great. I think that's going to put a lot of affordable electric vehicles in the market. And, I think it would be a shame not to have something matching that here in the U.S.
Yeah. And here again, this is why I think the letter from the senators to President Trump is so stupid, because we could be learning from each other. Right. And so, and creating jobs. And so just because that's kind of gives BYD more access to the U.S. market, and sort of allows them to have products produced here that can avoid tariffs and things like that. Nevertheless, we need to be learning from each other. Like we need to learn from them. And we need to acknowledge that, the ways that China has built its very sophisticated manufacturing supply chain, and its innovation around these issues, we should be learning from each other. We should be engaged. And so anyway, I just wanted to check in. Was this an interesting conversation in terms of, sort of discussing both the process of the 5-year plan, but also sort of what the priorities have been, like, and sort of how it relates to my view of China as being a better capitalist nation than communist China being better capitalist than capitalist democracy of the United States.
Yes, yeah, I think it is really interesting, and I think it is that the coordinated effort part, I think, is the strength of China's economy. I do want to mention, and when you say that, you're making both sides a little bit uncomfortable, and I think that that's a sign of a truly independent thinker when you're making everybody unhappy.
Well.
Right, because China doesn't want to be seen as capitalist, and
Right.
America wants to think it's best at capitalism. So I think, the way each country sees its own economy and wants to talk about it, I think it's different than how you see it. But I think you're looking at it from a truly independent lens.
Well, thank you for that. And that's a wonderful compliment. And you're right, though, when I've gotten calls from our own State Department saying I better take that website posting down, it was disconcerting to me. But I've had similar interactions with people in China when I give talks there, or the idea that you better be a little careful. You can't use the word capitalism the same way you think you can. So anyway, but I think to your point, it is sort of smart market economics. And so I think it's an interesting time to really be observing both countries and seeing how we're developing. So anyway, I want to thank you for an awesome conversation again. I'm so glad we're back to talking. I know it's been a really busy season for you, but I think our conversations are really enjoyable and great. And I always learn a lot from talking to you about how Americans are viewing the issues in China and how I should be a scholar who speaks to both sides.
Yes, yeah. It's been fun, and my head was buried in taxes for the last month, it seems. But it's nice to be back in the world, and I feel like I'm able to see a little bit further into the landscape these days. So yes, always enjoyable to have conversations with you, Doc.
I'll look forward to our talk next week. Thanks.
Sounds good.
Bye.